Welcome to the fall 2016 version of the Paul C. Wilt Lecture Series of the Phi Kappa Phi. Phi Kappa Phi is a national honor society that's open to all disciplines, and Westmont's chapter of Phi Kappa Phi was established in 1976. And Paul Wilt, for whom this series is named, was instrumental in establishing the local chapter and was very important in the governance originally. I think this is the first Phi Kappa Phi lecture that I've come to that I've not seen Paul sitting right there. A word about this evening's format. After I introduce our speaker, we will hear from him for about 45 minutes. Afterwards, I will introduce our two respondents, and they will briefly reflect on what we've heard. And then our speaker will have a few minutes to respond to those thoughts. And then the floor will be open for anyone in the audience to ask questions or comment, with priority given to students. About 8:30, we will adjourn our session and take refreshments outside, although I encourage you to continue the conversation informally. Our speaker this evening is Professor Alister Chapman. Professor Chapman is a Cambridge man through and through, and by that I mean that all of his university degrees are from Cambridge. I was tempted to say that all of his university training was in Cambridge, but being the rigid mathematician that I am, I was fearful that you might have taken a course or a seminar outside of Cambridge and I would be in error historically in this session on things historical. In any regard, after completing his PhD at Cambridge, Professor Chapman came to Westmont, where he has been teaching in the history department since 2004. A very well-respected colleague, Professor Chapman, was recognized as the Social Science Teacher of the Year in 2004 and received the Faculty Research Award in 2013. Externally, Professor Chapman won a Christianity Today Book Award for his book on godly ambition, John Stott and the Evangelical Movement. More apropos to tonight's presentation, his research focus has been on the impact of immigration and imperial decline on English society after 1945. Two relatively recent publications in that vein are Can't We Just All Get Along? Muslim Immigrants to Britain and the Claims of Multiculturalism, published in Books and Culture, and The International Context of Secularization in England, the End of Empire, Immigration and the Decline of Christian National Identity, 1945 to 70, which appeared in the Journal of British Studies. Tonight's talk is entitled Immigration, the Best Thing for Britain Since Sliced Bread. Professor Chapman, we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, Professor Rosentrater. After such a generous introduction, it's maybe poor form to note just one small inaccuracy, but given that the inaccuracy had to do with numbers, I felt that as a mathematics professor that was appropriate to point out. Though maybe it's true, I arrived in Westmont in 2004 and won the Social Science Teacher of the Year Award in 2004. It was actually part of the deal I organized with the provost coming here, that I could just kind of have that award without having to earn it. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I know you'll have other things to do on an evening like tonight. Thanks to dear colleagues, at least a couple of whom I know only finished their final class at 6:30 this evening. And to my students, it's encouraging to see you here. I had a rather odd form of student feedback on my teaching last month. My colleague, Dr. Pointer, was on a Thinking Historically GE committee, and students had had opportunity to say what they thought of various professors. And one student had commented that my lectures were like well-rounded bedtime stories. So maybe that explains why you're here this evening, just to kind of get an early start on the night's rest. Thank you to the Phi Kappa Phi committee for inviting me to give this lecture, and I too am grateful to Paul and Doris Wilt. Paul taught in the history department, I think from 1958 to 94, if my date's correct, and they're still very interested in the life of the college and what goes on in the history department, so it's a particular honour for me to be giving this lecture named in Paul's honour tonight. Now, I should warn you before I get going that there is one small bit of audience participation this evening. I don't know whether you caught the inflection in Professor Rosentrater's voice, but the title is Immigration, the Best Thing for Britain Since Sliced Bread, ? Which of course leaves me leeway to see how we're doing and your responses as we go along as to what argument I want to make by the time I'm done. But it also raises the question of what other possible contenders might be. So you can be thinking about that, other possible contenders for the best thing to happen to Britain in the last 60 years or so. Now, as many of you know, the years since the Second World War saw significant immigration to the United Kingdom. From two parts of the British Empire, or former British Empire, the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, and then South Asia, especially India and Pakistan. And this meant that the society in which I grew up was very, very different from the society in which my grandfather did. I've been studying immigration in Britain for the last 5 years or so, with a particular emphasis on religion and immigration. Both what did it do to Christianity in Britain, to have new religions coming into the country, but also the religions of the people who came. And so in tonight's talk there will be Christians, there will also be Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus as well. My research focuses on the town in which I grew up, town of Darby. It's about 2 hours north of London, near Sherwood Forest, if you're familiar with that place. So I was sharing some of that research this evening. My work is mainly focused on the period from the 1960s to the 1990s. So there will be less on recent immigrants to the country, although I will touch on that at a couple of points in my remarks. If you came this evening hoping to hear about migration from the Middle East and from Syria, that talk would be entitled Immigration, the Best Thing for Germany Since Sliced Bread. There really haven't been many people coming from Syria to Britain over the last several years, so nothing on that, I'm afraid. My hope is that by the time we're done, you'll have had some reflections from me on developments in English society over the past 50 years or so, but there are going to be some implicit suggestions running through this about what some of these questions might mean for contemporary American society. Obviously, immigration is a major question in the current election cycle. Does America need to be made great again? Questions of national decline. Some of these questions are ones which Britain has very much been wrestling with over the last 50 years. And so certainly as I study this, in the back of my mind, there's always questions as to what it might mean for American society. Thankfully, I'm a historian, and so I never need to stick my neck out. Occasionally, unwisely, I do. But you can be making your own conclusions as we go along. So, that by way of preamble. Again, the title, Immigration, the Best Thing for Britain Since Sliced Bread. Well, does anybody know what time frame that actually covers? It's a phrase that we always use, but presumably we need to know when sliced bread began. And obviously the implication there is machine sliced bread, or else we've had sliced bread since the Egyptians and beyond, probably. Does anybody know when the first bread slicing machine was invented? I looked it up for the purposes of this talk. It was invented in Missouri in 1928 by Otto Fredrik Rohweder. So no prizes for guessing that. A good example of German engineering. But it wasn't introduced to the UK until 1937, when the Wonderloaf factory opened in Tottenham in North London. The start of major non-white migration to the United Kingdom dates to 1948, so the dates match up pretty well. Okay, immigration postdates sliced bread, therefore it's a contender for the prize of the best thing since sliced bread. However, there have, of course, been many, many good things to have happened to Britain since 1937. So perhaps we can start by coming up with a list of competitors for the palm of the best thing since sliced bread. Any suggestions?
A backhand cross-court by Roger Federer, match point at Wimbledon.
Okay, or Andy Murray winning Wimbledon. How about that? The British sports journalists have nothing to talk about anymore now. They can't say no British person has won since 1927 or whatever it was. What else? Any other ideas?
National Health Service.
National Health Service, yep. So National Provision of Healthcare, that was 1947. So that should go into the pot.
About chicken tikka masala.
We may get onto that depending on how far we get, but yes. Anything else? Any people? Any phenomenon? 1966 World Cup. I'm just trying to think what English people would say, or Scottish people, if you asked them. The one and only time when England won the Soccer World Cup would definitely go in the list. 2012 Olympics, maybe, doing well in the medals table. The publication of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I hope you know that the title of the book was changed when it was brought to the United States. You can go online and think about the reasons why they changed it. How about Queen Elizabeth II, who's now been reigning from 1952 to 2016 and still does hundreds of public engagements every year. I imagine if you did go to London or somewhere else in the country and asked what people thought had been the best thing to happen to the country since 1937, immigration would probably not come high on the list for most people. In fact, if you've read any of the British press over the last 6 months or so and have been following what's been going on with Brexit, you'll be aware that for many people they might say that immigration is one of the worst things that has happened to Britain over the last 60 years or so. Now, it's easy to be very critical of these people, in the same way that it's easy to be critical, perhaps, of people who support certain candidates in the election cycle going on in the United States at the moment. But here's an area where I think history can really help us. Historians get very used to dealing with very, very fallen people. History is the record of a fallen humanity. We expect it. But as historians look into the past, we do our best to assume that those whom we study are rational by their own lights, and they think they're doing the right thing. We may look back and disagree, but historians are people who at their best, and we don't always do a good job, we don't go into the past and point fingers at people and say, loser, you got it wrong. We go back into the past and say, why did people think it was a sensible thing to do to prosecute people for witchcraft, for example? Okay? That people are stupid or evil is not the historian's first conclusion. It may be our last, but before we get to that conclusion, we try and work hard to understand people and where they're coming from. And I try and do some of this with regard to people in the UK who have not been in favour of immigration to the country. Okay? I think it is important at the very least to ask some of the important questions that the debate over Brexit has raised. Who are we, the British or the English, as a people? What does it mean to be British? Are we defined ethnically? Are there particular values that define what it means to be British? Should we even try to define what it means to be a particular nation? One thing which I think is important to remember this evening is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, the people who lived on the island of Britain were remarkably homogeneous, ethnically speaking, and remarkably homogeneous religiously as well. And so the questions raised by immigration in Britain over the last few decades are acute. And I think even if we want to say that we shouldn't focus on national identity, which is an argument as a Christian I'd want to make, the reality is that still is a way in which so many people, including myself, define ourselves. And I think in an Olympic year in particular, we'd all be a bit dishonest if we denied that. The final thing I really want to say by way of preamble is that this is a difficult question because it's become politicized, both in Britain and in the United States. As will become clear, I'm generally a defender of immigration into the UK. And part of the problem, I think, in this debate, if you're on that side of the debate, so you're defending immigration, you have kind of a very easy argument to make, which runs something as follows. Either you're in favor of immigration or you're a racist. Okay? And that argument gets pretty politicized pretty quickly and pretty unfortunate pretty quickly because it makes it difficult for people to listen to one another and talk to one another. So I'm going to try and get beyond that simple dichotomy this evening if I can. So, has immigration been a good thing for Britain since the Second World War? Let's start with a more modest task, which is figuring out whether it's been a good thing or not, because obviously if it hasn't been a good thing, it drops out of the list of contenders for the best thing. To begin with, was it good for the people who came? Was it good for those who chose to leave their homelands? Was it good for their families? If it wasn't good for them, then it's unlikely to have been good for anybody else. Let me just tell you 3 stories as we begin, and these are all coming from people who I interviewed in Darby in the summers of 2014 and 2015. I'm going to start with Hardeel Singh. He was a Sikh, came from India in 1966, age 13. His father was already in England. He travelled alone, leaving his mother and his siblings back in India. The home in which he lived wasn't much of a home. He had to do all of his cooking for himself. He had to do all of his cleaning for himself. But his father brought him to England for the educational opportunities that he would have in England. As a Sikh, he had what's known as a patka, which is a small scarf on his head. That's what Sikh boys wear, because part of Sikh faith is you do not cut your hair if you're male. Eventually, that moves towards a turban, but as a 13-year-old coming over, Hardeel had one of these patkas. His father told him when he arrived that he'd have to go and get his hair cut short, so he didn't get into trouble at school. He went to the local English barber down the street and said, "Would you please cut off my long hair?" The white English barber, fascinatingly, even in 1966, refused to do it, saying that he didn't want to get involved with anything that might leave him with sin on his hands. So he went to school. He got punched on his first day. He remembers most of his teachers as kind. This was in the days before they had extra English language instruction, and so he had to pretty much figure things out for himself. There were a couple of other people in his school who spoke Punjabi, the language that he brought with him. He has one painful memory of speaking to one of his friends, Punjabi friends, in a French class, and the French teacher telling him to stand up because he was talking in class, being asked to put out his hand, put a pencil in between his fingers, and then twisted the pencil hard. I had to actually try that to kind of see what sort of effect it was, but it's certainly not pleasant. But he worked hard. He eventually would bring his wife Rupinda from India and start a family in England. Eventually he would start growing his hair again. And if you meet Hardeel today, he has a turban, and he works as a professor of biology at the University of Derby. Muhammad Riyasat arrived in England 5 years earlier, in 1961, at the age of 9. He was a Muslim from Pakistan, and indeed he was the first Pakistani at every school that he went to in England. His father came, as many immigrant fathers did, to work at metalworks in Derby. Derby is a centre of engineering and railways in England. Muhammad has remarkably good memories of school. Again, it was a case of sit in the classroom and see what you can figure out, because we really don't have much in the way of resources to help you. very early days for this migration at this stage. One of the interesting things about Muhammad's story, and this may be one of the reasons why his memories were so good, is he was very, very good at sports. So by the time he was a teenager, he was playing for Darby boys, which I suppose would be equivalent of like a little league team. It's kind of the farm system for the professional teams in England. Eventually he went on to become a champion powerlifter and arm wrestler. And he would go back to Punjab every couple of years, and he told me he only lost one arm wrestling match in the entire time that he was arm wrestling back in the Punjab. Had many friends. He had Sikh friends that he lifted with. Similar to Hadial, eventually he brings a wife from Pakistan. And at that time, as he has a wife and now children, that's when he starts to take his faith more seriously. When he came over, he knew that as a Muslim he shouldn't eat pork, but he and his father, I think, were both illiterate. And they really did not know much about Islam, and there wasn't an imam yet in town to teach them. But over the years, especially as he is raising his own children in England, he begins to take his Islamic faith more seriously. He grows a beard. Eventually he goes on the Hajj to Mecca, becomes director of the Pakistan Community Centre. Now retired, he spends his days looking after his disabled son. Edna Williamson came in 1962 at age 26 from Jamaica. She had grown up as a Christian in Jamaica and trained as a teacher there. But when she came to England, she was met with a decidedly cruel reception. The receptionist at the doctor's office told her that there was absolutely no way she was going to be allowed to teach in England. And she found the English churches cold and unwelcoming. And for a number of years, Edna Williamson gave up on her faith. She retrained as a nurse and became a senior nurse in a psychiatric hospital in Darby. She recommitted her life to Christ at the funeral of one of her friends and began attending a black Pentecostal church in town. Eventually, Edna went on to become a justice of the peace, which is like a lay judge. There isn't an equivalent in the American judicial system, but certainly a highly respected member of society. So those are just three examples. They could be multiplied. Let me just suggest four things that stand out from these stories and from others that I've had the privilege of listening to over the last several years. Number one, there certainly was and is racial prejudice and discrimination in British society, no question. And if you want more stories later on, I can give them to you. Secondly, that has lessened over time. The very fact that Edna Williamson becomes a justice of the peace is the sort of thing that back in the 1960s would have been very, very difficult to conceive. Similarly with Hardial Singh becoming a biology professor. Thirdly, despite the fact that things got better, by no means should we think that that means that things were easy. Just to take Edna's life for a moment, just before she left Jamaica, she had had a baby daughter whom she left with her mother while she went to get established in England. Once she was established, she wrote to her mother to say, "Would you please send my daughter?" And her mother said no. And she eventually went back, but her daughter didn't come with her, so she had a child with whom she had almost no contact for her entire life. And then Edna's husband would eventually decide he was just going to go back to Jamaica, that he'd had enough of life in England, didn't like it there. And so the last years that they were married, they were living in different countries. So getting better perhaps, but let's not underestimate the difficulties in dislocation. Fourthly, though, the experience was good enough so that they and their children stayed. Few of the people who came to England in these migrations were refugees. Most of them continued to go back to the countries from which they had come, and in some cases could have obviously bought one-way tickets and elected not to. I think a major consideration for that was their children. You all know the American dream. There is a British dream too. And for many of these families, the idea that their children would have access to good education, to free university education, was a compelling argument to stay in England despite the difficulties that they faced there. So, Was this migration good for the people who came? On balance, I think the answer is yes. But was it good for English society? That's a different question altogether. And we should start in the place where these conversations, sadly today, need to start with the question of terrorism. Britain has suffered grievously from terrorists coming from overseas, representing another religion, planting bombs in London, and killing police officers. But I'm not talking about Muslims there. I'm talking about the Irish. For decades, England was living in the fear not of Islamic terrorism, but of Republican terrorism coming from Ireland. And by no means am I knocking Ireland here. My mother's Irish, and I spent my summers there and loved the place. But terrorism is not a new thing for England. And indeed, terrorism is not a new thing for Europe. If you look at the number of people killed by terrorism in Europe over the last 40 years, there are many, many, many more people killed by terrorism in the 1970s and the 1980s than there have been since September the 11th. And basically all of those terrorists in one way or another would have identified as Christians. Two main groups, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which spilled over in Southern Ireland and into Britain, and then the ETA group, the Basque separatist group in northern Spain. Far more deadly than Islamic terrorists have been, as awful as that has been over the past 10 to 15 years or so. Okay, Europeans today are 10 times more likely to die falling down the stairs as they are from a terrorist attack. Okay, so is terrorism bad? Yes. Have some of these terrorists come from these groups of migrants coming to Europe? Clearly they have. But I think we kind of have a question of balance here. You know, in England, which is the country we're looking at this evening, you're looking at half a dozen attacks or so over the last 20 years with fewer than 100 people killed on one side of the balance. And against that you have to weigh all of the extraordinary contributions that people from these migrant communities have made to British life over the last 50 years or so. And some of these names you won't know, some of them you will. If you don't know them, you can look them up on YouTube, some of them, and find them. Lenny Henry, wonderful West Indian comedian. Mo Farah, the 5,000, 10,000 meter runner, got 4 golds now, I think. His real name is Muhammad Farah, came from Somalia. Zadie Smith, the novelist. Freddie Mercury and Queen. John Barnes and any number of football players. Sadiq Khan, the current mayor of London. Damon Buffini, a black British businessman, etc., etc. And in many cases, these people had opportunities in Britain that they may not have had at home. So, is terrorism bad? Absolutely. But does that mean the argument's closed? It hasn't been good for Britain? I don't think so. The next question that has to be addressed, because it's come up an awful lot in the recent debates, is the idea that migrants have been a drain on the economy. And the simple argument here is that these people come from Pakistan or wherever it might be, and they have lots of children, and they make excessive use of the National Health Service and public housing, and then they don't get jobs and live off unemployment benefit, etc., etc. And this is perhaps the thing above anything which has led to resentment among the British population, and it was a major part of the Brexit campaign. Now, I'm a little worried that Dr. Knoll is in the room tonight, because this question gets to the heart of some very thorny debates about unemployment in economics. Essentially, there are two contradictory truths about migration and employment in Britain over the last 60 years or so. On the one hand, Britain has needed more labour. Especially after the Second World War, there was a need among British companies for more workers of various sorts. But on the other hand, you've always had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% unemployment in Britain since the Second World War. Okay? And so those two things, or the second at least, makes it easy to understand why there might be resentment. If you are a white British person and you are struggling to find a job and you're seeing these immigrants coming in, all of a sudden it's easy to understand why one can become angry. How do these go together? Let me suggest there's three things that immigrants bring with them which help us resolve this dilemma. Number one, they're willing to do jobs that other people aren't willing to do, or they're willing to do them at a wage that others aren't willing to do them at. Number two, they're willing to travel to where jobs are. Okay? If you are from Southern California and you've lived all your life there, and in 20 years' time the bottom falls out of the SoCal economy for whatever reason, and you may know that there are jobs in Kansas or in New York, but you may just not want to go to those places because of your rootedness in a particular place. And then thirdly, there were particular skills in many cases that Britain needed. Some of the jobs that were filled were low-skilled, but not all of them were. And there's been a regular shortage of nurses and doctors, for example, in Britain over the last 60 years. And Britain has been very willing, somewhat controversially, to poach doctors from other parts of the world to help fill spots in England. Okay. Now, overall, the question comes down to figures. And the key question is, so some migrants come and work, and some obviously do end up needing public assistance of one form or another. So how do those two stack up? There's figures from more recent history. Between 1995 and 2011, when you started seeing significant migration to Britain from Eastern Europe, so Poles, Latvians, Romanians, etc., economists reckon that European migrants made a net contribution of $6.4 billion to the British purse, i.e., they came, they worked, they paid taxes, right? Then they made some use of the NHS, etc., of healthcare. But the difference between that is they seem to have been paying much more in tax than they have been taking out in welfare payments. Now, that's obviously after the main period that we're looking at this evening, and data is much harder for that earlier period. But what I can tell you from speaking to many migrants in Darby is very, very clearly these people came to work. There was no expectation that they were going to come to England and somehow sponge off the state. And I found a whole range. I spoke to a husband and wife who both worked as doctors in the community, and I spoke to a Sikh fellow who was a bus driver. But regardless, these were people who came to work and did work. Now, there are immigrants on welfare, but when you look at that kind of in Britain today, often what's happened is when people came to Derby, they often came to work in foundries, so they were working on castings or other light industrial metal fittings. There are other groups who went further north to some of England's textile districts, and that was a bad move because after the Second World War, by the time you get to the 60s, that textile industry in Britain really went downhill. And so if you look at Muslim communities in Barnsley, for example, you're going to find a town where there's just an awful lot of unemployment, whether you're talking about white British or you're talking about people from the Muslim community there, simply because the industry there has collapsed. So it's no surprise that you will have some people ending up on welfare for that reason. Okay. One more little piece of the economic dimension before we move on. One of the issues in European countries, Britain is actually less affected than this than most, is there's a declining birth rate. And that's really bad if your pension scheme, your public pension scheme like Social Security, is basically funded by the people currently working, okay, because there are going to be fewer people working. And so for all of the complaining about immigration in places like Britain and Germany and so on and so forth, if those people want their pensions, they need to figure out some way of getting more people into their country fast and get them working, or else they're going to be out of luck at 65. Okay? So, that's the economic impact. Let's talk about the social and cultural impact. Okay, fine, maybe the numbers work out, but if English society is a less pleasant place to live, then obviously we have a problem. Okay, again, and this here I think the debate is different from the one in the United States regarding immigration. For centuries, the large majority of the English population looked pretty much like me. And so when West Indians started arriving in England in 1948, it was very noticeable. Initially, it was noticeable really only in London. That's where the early wave of immigrants settled. Eventually, they're going to move north to industrial towns like Derby, Birmingham, Leicester, Manchester, etc. More recently, with the new migrants from Eastern Europe, they have been moving into rural areas, often working in construction or agriculture. And that was very important for the Brexit vote, because over the last decade even, there have been people whose communities have been changed fairly rapidly by new families moving into the neighbourhood. Part of the difficulty here is that the picture of Britain 60, 70, 80 years ago is a nostalgic one, and it is an entirely white one. It's easy for people to look back wistfully to the days of Enid Blyton's famous Five, or Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons, if you know either of those stories. Or the days of Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. The Calormains, of course, were of darker skin. If you've read The Horse and His Boy, they're the baddies in the story. If you're English, Bag End and the Shire are obviously English places. Okay? Parenthetically, even J.K. Rowling has been accused of playing into this. If you've read those books, you know that there are people representing England's ethnic minorities, but the school is quintessentially classic English, and even the minority characters, as I understand it, I haven't actually read all the books, you can ask me why later if you're interested, play essentially white English roles. Okay, so that's literary culture. Even if you just think about general working class English culture, there's a vision of British society which is white and united, a Britain of mines and mills, of fish and chips and picture houses. And it's very easy to see immigration as having destroyed all of this. Is it true? Well, it's easy to romanticize the past, and there's an obvious parallel here in the United States, yes, and the fondness for the 1950s. The obvious point that's made with regard to the United States is, well, that's a great world if you were white, if you forget about the racism that existed in American society in the 50s. The analogue for Britain is, well, you can look back to being Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy, but if you'd lived back then, you probably wouldn't have been Peter and Edmund and Susan and Lucy. It was a great time to live if you were from an upper middle class family, but statistically speaking, most of us wouldn't have been. Okay, you watch the Jane Austen dramas and you think how wonderful it would have been to live in England during those days. My father's done the family history, and my family was delivering milk at the time, and certainly not swanning around learning the piano. But, again, I think we have to be careful to take others' perspectives seriously and present these people as rational and good, even if we might disagree. Is the picture of a small town where everyone knew each other's name and shared many of the same beliefs romanticized? Yes. But is it entirely untrue? No. And it's unsurprising that many lament that loss. I think we need to be careful before we demonize people here. I was thinking about an analogy today. I live over in faculty housing, which is a wonderful place, in part because all the people there are amazing Westmont faculty, right, students? Yeah. That means that when our children kind of run away and we don't know where they are, we're fairly confident that if Abraham's over playing with Eli, that, Dr. Song isn't kind of, showing him, inappropriate television or, something scandalous like that. let's say for whatever reason, Las Blancas in 30 years' time changed dramatically, and all of a sudden you had just a typical cross-section of American society. Might I look back and wish for the good old days? Yes, I might. Even if I thought that the new days were good too, right? One of the problems with living in Las Blancas is the opportunities for, building relationships with non-Christian neighbours is muted, especially after the Fahadians left the neighbourhood. But is there something wonderful, something good about a more diverse community as well as the good old days? And I think there is. And you see this in some of the stories of people I spoke to. And I'm going to tell you the stories now of four white British people who I spoke to a couple of summers ago. All of them, two couples, all of them nonagenarians. It was just so sweet speaking to these very elderly people. Tony and Helen Lyons moved to Darby in the 1950s, went to a Pentecostal church, spoke very, very warmly of George Francis, a Jamaican who became a deacon in their church, told wonderful stories of warm relationships with their Sikh neighbours, borrowing chairs, neighbourly life, taking their South Asian friends' children to church and so on. Judith and Eric Raven. Judith was born in 1921, has lived in Darby her entire life. Grew up in this parish which was highly homogeneous, but it was the parish where many of the migrants moved when they first came to Darby in the 1950s and 60s. And so they bought a house on Sunny Hill Avenue in 1956. It was all white. And nowadays, 50% of their neighbours are from South Asian communities in town. Okay? And, they are kind of not sure exactly what they think of all of this. And they certainly weren't sure when I was interviewing them. But again, it's clear that they have developed relationships with some of their neighbours from different ethnic groups, and they now have non-white people coming to their little Anglican parish church. Okay? And these are the older people, right? I mean, these are the people who, in a sense, you'd expect to be the most resistant, perhaps, to the changes that have taken place. Okay? Now, part of the challenge with assessing whether immigration has been good for England or not is that you can't conduct a controlled experiment. That has been changing in England, but all sorts of other things have been changing over the last 60, 70 years or so as well. And there's four in particular that I want to flag for you briefly. Major changes in English society whose history has been interwoven with that of changes in the population. Number one, declining British power. Okay? India gets independence from Britain in 1947, and that's going to be the first of many British colonies which receive their independence. Britain goes from being a global leading power to being a second-rate power. Secondly, a decline in church-going. A significant decline in the number of people who are attending church in England, especially in the 1960s. Thirdly, increased health. People are taller, people are living longer than they did. The National Health Service that Audra mentioned earlier has made a big contribution there. And fourthly, increased wealth. The British GDP has been going up steadily since the Second World War. Now, I want to suggest that all four of these were good in their own way, and then bring that back round to immigration. Now, I'm going to assume that you think 3 and 4 are good for the moment, increasing health and wealth. But I want to take the first two, declining British power and declining British church going, and link them. Okay? For centuries, Christianity was central to English and British national identity. And there was a civil religion which gave British people the idea that their country somehow enjoyed God's favour and had a perhaps divinely ordained mission in the world. After the Second World War, however, as Britain's sense of global purpose dissipated, and its power and prestige as well, that sense of national mission went away. And I think you can link that to the decline in church going. Let's go to church if we feel that we are God's nation and we have good work to do in the world. This is one possible reason why church going is held up so well in the United States. But when the country no longer thinks it has a role from God to play in the world, well, then maybe church going is going to go down. And certainly that happened in England. One of the good results of this, though, is that the churches started focusing less on national mission and more on Christ's mission. Okay, this was especially true in the Church of England. And it was striking how elderly Anglicans to whom I spoke in Derby really didn't lament the decline in church numbers very much at all. They basically assumed that these people were nominal Christians, more or less dead wood, and now that they weren't there anymore, they could get on with the work of evangelism more enthusiastically. Since the 1960s, there's been a big increased emphasis on church life in the local church and on evangelism in most English churches. All of this is happening at the same time that the migrants are arriving. Some of them are Christian immigrants, right? Especially those coming from Jamaica. Most of them are non-Christian. So one group they have to figure out how to integrate into their churches. The other they have to figure out how to reach out to them. And unsurprisingly, they found these two new tasks very difficult. The good news is they're now doing increasingly well at both. Wonderful gentleman I spoke to, Jeff Pickup, was pastor of a Pentecostal church in Darby for many years. The church he ministered to was right in the heart of the migrant community. He started off as a youth pastor and reached out to all of these Sikh and Hindu families. They had about 60 people coming from South Asia baptized in their church. If you go to that church today, you'll see 20 flags on the walls representing all the nations from which people in that church come. The Darby Diocesan Missionary and Ecumenical Council, it's about as fusty as you can get. I mean, this is kind of a little kind of Anglican community. You can go and read their minutes. They're clearly interested in reaching out to everyone who God has brought to Darby. And you see this wonderful development as you read the minutes of this group, that they really want to reach people for Jesus, and they also are passionate about combating racism and prejudice and discrimination in their city. Okay, so some wonderful things I think going on in the churches in Darby. And as I spoke to people from all sorts of different groups in Darby, it became clear that it was not just the Christians who were longing for and working for a better society. There were shared hopes for society among all who practiced religion, regardless of their race and regardless of their religion. And what I've argued in a recent article is that what you've seen in Darby is, in a sense, a growth of a new civil religion. It's not focused on kind of the empire and England is somehow a divinely favored nation anymore, but it is religious groups together committed to the good of their city and their society. Okay? Committed to civic virtue, committed to sobriety, committed to modesty, committed to a place for religion in schools. And you can make the argument that without immigration, English society would be very different than it is. You can certainly make the argument that without immigration, Christianity would be a much less hospitable place for Christians today than it is. Okay? Now, that's not a story that gets told very often in the media for obvious reasons. But what you see in Darby is religious groups pulling together without losing their distinctiveness. Just to give one example, 1992, the Barbary Mosque in Ayodhya, how do I pronounce that? Ayodhya was razed to the ground by Hindus. And some Muslims in India, in Darby, were mad. And they petrol bombed the Hindu temple. And what is striking when you read the local press after that was just how the leaders of the Hindu and Muslim communities just lockstep came together and both said, we will not stand for this kind of thing, held a joint prayer vigil, and within a week the issue had gone out of the papers. So, I think some of the story helps to explain the relative lack of terrorism in the UK. There have been jobs for the migrants in most cases, and there has been a significant degree of integration, and although multiculturalism has not always worked, there have been some successes. One of the best signs that I saw, and this is ironic because it's not good, was to hear some of the people who came from South Asia in the 1960s complaining bitterly about the Polish people who had just come. They're complaining about the new immigrants and basically accusing the new immigrants of exactly the same thing that they had been accused of 60 years before. But that's a good sign of people, I think, feeling at home in British society. So, immigration, the best thing for Britain since sliced bread? Well, let's question the question. As good liberal arts students that you are, the first question you need to ask is, has sliced bread been good for Britain since 1937? I was certainly grateful for it when as a student I lived on a diet of beans on toast. However, you can make links between sliced bread and the poor quality of that bread and things like obesity and, horror of all horrors, acne. So I would argue that there are many things for Britain that have been better than sliced bread over the last 60 years, and that immigration was one of them. It's been good for the economy. It's been good for the ongoing importance of religion in society. It's been good for Christian mission in society. And it has brought a wonderful degree of cultural diversity and vitality to the country. Now, you can say all that and still have sympathy for those who are more critical of the impact of immigration, either because it has changed the society that they knew so much and they're struggling to adjust, or because they have been hurt by changes in the British economy that have nothing to do with immigration in terms of globalization, and are in pain and are tempted to blame newcomers. So, a good, has it been the best? Well, I'm going to dodge that question. I think that would be a very difficult thing to say it was absolutely the best. The NHS, I think, is an excellent contender for that. Improvements in women's rights, I think, would be another one. Very difficult to say what's best. But seeing as we're talking about food, let's end with the contribution of immigrants to British cuisine. Now, let me rebuke you. Any of you who have bought into the stereotype of poor British cuisine, all of my English friends, when they come to this country, are just, the only thing they ever say about American food is, the portions are so big. Because they only go to Applebee's or Chili's or something like that. Similarly, if you went to Britain in the 1950s and 60s and all you did was eat at restaurants in England, you would justifiably come back with a poor perception of British food. But next time you're in England, send me an email, and if I'm there, you can come and eat with my parents and get real English food, which is very, very good. But as good as my mother's cooking is, I think we can all give thanks that there are now also wonderful tandoori places, kebab joints, and all sorts of other things, which have certainly made England a richer place and more tasty place to live since the invention of the sliced bread machine. Thank you very much.